Is it on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Hi guys, this is Xenia from Alexa Real Estate, and I'm here with Anthony, and we actually just had our very first Zoom seminar for our monthly meetings, Investor IQ, except the voice didn't, the voice on it didn't actually work, so it didn't record. So we got a nice picture on it, but it didn't record. So this is take 2, and we're doing it again. So this one's going to be much better. So whoever was on that Zoom call, and if you see this one again, it's going to be a little bit different, but hopefully this one will be a little bit more smoother. So this is not the Zoom call. This is actually just a recording that we're doing, because we're a little bit upset that we didn't get any noise on that. So let's take it away. I've got Anthony here. Anthony is one of the junior staff members now in Alexa Real Estate. He's also doing year 12. He's also my son, and he's also training to be an investor. So he's learning as we go, and he's got some interview questions today. So you want to take it away, Anthony?
All right, thanks, Mum. So I was, for the first question, just wondering, what would you say the number one challenge facing landlords today is?
Okay, so the number one challenge that is facing landlords at the moment, so let's set the scene. We are absolutely in the middle of COVID-19 right now, and there's been a lot of changes. Right at the beginning of this, there was changes happening all the time. Like almost every day we had to check the legislation to see if it's different. Now, towards the end of March, the government had released an eviction moratorium. And that means that tenants can no longer be evicted for 6 months. So what that actually means is that even if a tenant is not paying rent, so they're in default, they can't actually be evicted. So a property manager or a landlord, or whoever's managing that property, will follow through the Arrears Protocol, and once it gets to the stage of eviction, that tenant will get to stay in that property. Now, if I can just go backtrack a little bit and tell you a bit about the Arrears Protocol, what that is. So if a tenant stops paying rent for whatever reason, within 14 days, a property manager should be taking legal action, start commencing legal action, starting with a breach notice against that tenant. And usually the tenant will be given some kind of chance to catch up through a payment plan. And if they keep defaulting continuously on that payment plan, then an eviction will be granted to the landlord, which means that the tenant needs to vacate that property, and the landlord can get vacant possession of that property and then recoup those arrears through another means. Usually it's an insurance claim or a claim against the tenant. But whatever, or mitigating those losses again by getting another tenant in that property. And we've got to keep in mind that a property is actually an investment. So, if you buy shares and the shares start going down, what do you need to do? All right, you need to cut your losses. You don't just allow a share portfolio to keep going down and down. You want to cut your losses. And same with a rental property. If you've got a rental property and the tenant stops paying rent, you need to cut your losses, get another tenant in there, mitigate your losses, and do what you can to keep that income going again. So right now with the eviction moratorium, it's actually really, really hard to do that. So the government's actually said that you can't do that. You've got to keep that property, that tenant in there for 6 months. Now, the reason why it's the number one challenge facing landlords at the moment is because we're going to look at who those landlords are. So when we think of the word landlord, sometimes we think a very rich person who has got 1,000 investment properties and they can afford to hold a few of them vacant. That's not always the case. That is the case for a few very lucky individuals. But that's not always the case. So a landlord could actually be a person who would have been a pensioner if they did not have an investment property. So sometimes one single investment property can render a person ineligible for a pension, and that property is the only income that they get. So when there is a moratorium on evictions, usually that causes a lot of financial stress for landlords. So, it's got to be managed correctly when it goes into court. And when I'm in court, I mean the SACAT, the South Australian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or Magistrates Court. They need to consider the landlord's financial situation before granting an eviction moratorium to those tenants. Now, another thing that I want to mention is that not every tenant is eligible for an eviction moratorium. So tenants can't just decide that we don't want to pay rent, and we don't have to pay rent for 6 months. They need to actually prove financial hardship, and they need to prove financial hardship as a result of COVID-19. There has been a few rude shocks where tenants have been challenged by property managers or landlords and have been evicted because they were not able to substantially prove that their hardship was a result of COVID-19. And keep in mind that this COVID-19 thing that's happening, it is genuinely affecting a lot of people. And, those we need to consider the financial situation of those people. But if you're a lazy person, a person that didn't want to work, this is a fantastic time to actually use it as an excuse to do nothing. And, that it will come through. It will come through. You'll be found out. If you are just using it as an excuse to do nothing, it's not going to go through.
Right. So obviously we'll see probably a lot of that. It does show.
Yeah.
Yeah. So following on from that, would you recommend that landlords reduce their rent to keep tenants?
Yeah, so that's another thing that that landlords can do is a voluntary rent reduction, and this is really different to an eviction moratorium. So an eviction moratorium is actually a legislative change where the government says that you can't legally evict tenants. A voluntary rent reduction is where a landlord decides to reduce the rent partially, and most landlords are reducing it by a fraction, 20%, 50% of the rent for an amount of time, usually about 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and just to help that tenant along. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is where a landlord chooses not to voluntarily reduce the rent. They're faced with a couple of challenges. One of them is that the courts actually want to see some kind of negotiation between tenants and landlords, and they want to see landlords sort of coming to the party and trying to make some kind of arrangement. The other one is that you face the risk of the tenant just getting up and leaving. So they can't afford. They want a 50% rent reduction. They can't afford the property. If they don't get it, they'll get up and leave. So what you've got to consider financially, what are the risks of that? So if you've got a property that is a very high-end property, like $1,000, $1,500 a week, where that property is hard to tenant, or the tenant pool is not as much. You may consider a small rent reduction to keep the tenant rather than allowing that tenant to go and then facing vacancies. So you've got to weigh out the costs, what's going to cost you more, vacancies or a rent reduction? The other risk is that if it has been a voluntary rent reduction, you can't then go and claim that money back from the tenant because you've just given them a rent reduction. Whereas if no rent reduction had been given, and the landlord or the property manager has followed the appropriate Arrears Protocol, and the eviction has actually been overruled by a tenancy tribunal or magistrates court, and the moratorium has been put in place, then that landlord could have a case later on to say, I didn't agree to this. And I would like some kind of compensation back, either a rent claim through an insurance or a claim against the tenant or something. I'm not sure what's going to emerge there, but they would be eligible for that money to come back later on after 6 months after the moratorium has been fulfilled. Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is it depends, basically. If you can make more money by doing it, say if your property is hard to tenant in a high-end property, then yes.
Yes, of course. So considering the risks of both. So if you've got, if you're the owner of an investment property, you've got all this income coming to you, and you've got a good tenant that's been in there for 5 years, and all of a sudden they can't afford the rent, and they would like 6 weeks of 20% vacancy, or 20% reduction, and if they don't get that, they're going to walk. You've got to consider that, what is that? That could be, 20% could be, a little bit of rent compared to a vacancy, which could take a bit longer. So, all of these have to be considered and both sides looked at, and instead of just handing it over.
Right, and if you're not sure, just seek professional advice. There's a lot out there right now.
We're here. Yeah.
So, anyway, moving on. Have you seen any patterns emerging from the madness during COVID?
Yeah, in rentals. Yeah, look, one of the things that we've actually seen, which was a little bit unpredictable, is that landlords are actually choosing to live in their properties. So we've seen a bit of a pattern, at least in our office, and I've spoken to a few other offices that have seen the same, where landlords are turning around and saying, okay, so the government's just turned around and said, we potentially could not get any rent for 6 months, so we're going to take the property back and live in it, put our mum in it, put our brother in it, put our kids in it, anything except having it as a rental. So there's a lot of rentals actually going back for private use at the moment, for probably a lot more than I've seen in a long time, and I think that's a little bit of a pattern, and that is a direct result of people just saying, oh no, I am not going to hold a property without a tenant, without any income for 6 months, and be responsible for the repairs on that property. So I would rather live in it until all this shamozu is over, and then I'll put it back on the market for rent again. So what that's, if that continues long term, and if that continues in a way that, there's the percentage of those properties actually increases, what we'll probably see in the market is that the supply will go down. So the supply of rentals available on the market will go down, and when supply goes down, then demand goes up, rents go up. So that's just a normal economic model. If some of the rentals are removed from the market, then the only thing that could really happen is that the rent will be pushed up. Yeah.
Okay, and I couldn't imagine people would feel so easy to tell their kids or their brother or their uncle, get out of my house after this. So it very well could affect the supply. Yeah,
that's right. So if mum and dad want to stay in that house longer term, then yes. But certainly for the short term, we could pretty much see an increase in rental prices.
Right. Yeah. And just a question for me: would you say that it's a good time to buy?
Good time to buy properties at the moment. Look, I think it's always a good time to buy rental properties, and it depends. It depends on the properties. Like Anthony's about to turn 18. I started buying properties when I was 19. I never looked at the time clocks and the economic clocks and stuff like that. And I know some people go by that. I went by my own personal circumstances. So I had saved a deposit. It's a good time to buy a property. I don't have a deposit. It's not a good time to buy a property. So just keep it simple, and there's always going to be some kind of good property out in the market that's a good buy kind of at any time. So for you, I would say save up a deposit, get a deposit happening, get the money together, get finance together, and then once you find that property, then that's the best time to buy a property.
So yes, in short.
Yes, in short. Yeah.
I've actually broken the rules a bit. She told me not to ask any out there questions before this started. Anyway, no more questions on my end.
No more questions. We didn't have anything on. Oh, okay. Oh, very good. So that's probably it for me. Look, guys, if you've got any questions, I'll be really, really happy to answer them. My email is xenia@alexarealestate.com.au. That's XENIA @Alexa, ALEXA, realestate.com.au. Shoot me some questions. I would love to answer them. My phone number is 0412 437 582. Send an SMS and I can call you back. As you can imagine, I'm an agency principal. I get a lot of phone calls during the day. And when's a good time to call? Probably never. But I can call you back. All right, that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from everyone.
Thanks for joining us, guys. See ya.
Thank you.